This is Rick Malone for the San Francisco Symphony. By the time Dmitri Shostakovich began writing his Eighth Symphony in 1943, he had been celebrated, condemned, rehabilitated, condemned again, and rehabilitated yet again for offenses against Soviet artistic policy. The symphony itself followed the same path after its premiere that year, and it's only recently that it has finally received the kind of serious attention that a major symphony by a major composer deserves. Shostakovich wrote his Eighth Symphony in the middle of World War II. It was just 2 years after his monumental Seventh, the Leningrad Symphony, which had quickly become the most performed piece of contemporary music in the world. But the premiere of the Eighth was not a success, perhaps because it was not a rousing, crowd-pleasing propaganda piece like the Seventh had been. Nobody quite knew what to make of it, and it was only performed a few more times. Then in 1948, the Soviet authorities had Shostakovich in their sights again, and the Eighth was singled out as, quote, not a musical work at all, a composition which has nothing whatsoever to do with art, end quote. In 1956, when Shostakovich was back in the government's good graces, he tried to explain the piece. He wrote, "In this work there was an attempt to express the emotional experiences of the people, to reflect the terrible tragedy of war. Composed in the summer of 1943, the Eighth Symphony is an echo of that difficult time, and in my opinion, quite in the order of things." End quote. Well, amazingly, the government agreed, and composer and symphony began appearing in concert halls once again. It's possible that Shostakovich's Eighth would have seemed less problematic to his contemporaries if they had known Mahler's symphonies as well as he did, or as well as we do now. The unusual structures, novel instrumental contrasts and combinations, and the orchestral sound, which can veer in an instant from bombast to intimacy. These are all things that Shostakovich learned from studying Mahler's symphonies before adding his own distinctive stamp. Serge Koussevitzky, the great conductor and champion of contemporary music, once said that the opening adagio of Shostakovich's Eighth was a moment which, by the power of its human emotion, surpasses everything else created in our time. End quote. Listeners who knew Shostakovich's Fifth Symphony would have noticed the similarities to the opening of that piece, but if they were expecting a victory symphony like that work seemed to be, they certainly would have been surprised. The movement flows smoothly from one beautiful and expressive passage to another. Occasionally interrupted by military episodes, as if the audience would need to be reminded that this was wartime. There's a wrenching climax with woodwinds screaming over leaping strings. and agonizing outbursts from the brass and violins. Shostakovich's signature sardonic sense of humor makes its first appearance in an off-kilter passage that's halfway between a march and a gallop. Another orchestral scream resolves into a beautiful melody for the English horn. The first movement takes up almost half of this symphony, and it could almost be a complete piece in and of itself, given its range of emotions, until the last 4 quiet notes on the trumpet finally bring it home in peace. The next 3 movements are all character marches. One of Shostakovich's contemporaries described them as an heroic march, a scherzo march, and a funeral march. But the first has more of the grotesque than the heroic. The main theme does get a moment of lyrical treatment. But it's followed by one of Shostakovich's signature sounds, the combination of piccolo with the high-pitched E-flat clarinet, which heightens the parody. There's a mock heroic passage, and a passage of skittering strings that looks forward to Shostakovich's Ninth Symphony, another musical joke that got him in trouble with the government. The movement winds down to almost nothing, then ends with a dramatic coda. The second march was characterized as a scherzo, which is Italian for joke, but Shostakovich was a master of musical disguise, and the relentless pounding could just as easily represent the savagery of Stalin and the Soviet regime. Punctuated with the screams and hammer blows that are the soundtrack of torture and repression. Two great cries pierce the nightmare and open the way to the next slow movement, the funeral march. It's written as a passacaglia, a set of variations over a repeated bass line. Shostakovich used this musical form many times, each time building from almost nothing to a powerful climax. Here, he repeats the underlying pattern 11 times. finishing with one of the eeriest moments in all orchestral music. Then, simply and quietly, the clarinets make a radical key change. To begin the finale. This movement takes us from the public Shostakovich of the symphonies, ballets, and film scores to the private Shostakovich of the string quartets, most of which he kept hidden since he knew the Soviet regime would not approve. So quiet, so intimate, and ultimately so powerful. In many ways, though, this movement represents the return to life after the profound tragedy and cynicism of the three marches. The war music returns. With the primal scream. But then it all collapses, and the bass clarinet and violin chime in on the absurdity of it all. Shostakovich actually offered to put this movement into words. "Life is beautiful," he said. "All that is dark and ignominious will disappear. All that is beautiful will triumph." And in the last pages, so spacious and beautiful, with the memory of tragedy still hovering, there is firmness, acceptance, serenity. And maybe even something of hope. This is Rick Malone for the San Francisco Symphony.